Okay, so we left off in the last video with the overshoot of some populations, but then stabilizing around carrying capacity. So let's look at the next section. Life history traits are products of natural selection. An organism's life history comprises the traits that affects its schedule of reproduction and survival. So life history traits are evolutionary outcomes reflected in the development, physiology, that means the workings, the inner workings of the organs and so on, and behavior of the organism. So let's look at evolution and life history diversity. A life history entails three main variables: the age at which reproduction begins, how often the organism reproduces, and how many offspring are produced per reproductive episode. So can you see that the earlier an organism reproduces, the earlier in life, the more often they reproduce, so they have kids more often, and then how many kids they have, if they have a litter, all right, and 10 kids versus 1 kid, all those three things will create a bigger reproductive, a bigger increase in the population size. So those three things are your main variables. So trade-offs in life history. So organisms have finite resources. So we just talked about that with the logistic growth and it leveling off, which may lead to trade-offs between survival and reproduction. So there are certain things that you have to give up to gain other things. So that's the trade-off part. For example, there is a trade-off between survival and paternal care in European kestrels. So if we look at the next page here, you have a graph. Now let's look to see what the graph is showing us. So on the x-axis, you can see is the brood size. So this is the number of eggs that the parents had. So normal, small, so that's a reduced or enlarged brood size. And this is the percentage of the parents that are survived to the following the winter. And so you can see that normal brood size, you have a survival rate, all right, roughly a little less than 60, a little bit below 60. The reduced brood size is almost 100% in females and, 85 or so % in males. So you have a high survival rate here. But look at what happens the bigger the brood size gets. The survival rate goes down. Way more than in males than females, but still that goes down. And so what happens is that what we can learn from this, I'm going to put here, caring for more offspring negatively affects the survival of the parents. I'm going to put here dad more than mom. I'll just use the greater than symbol. Okay? And so that's what we can learn from that. So some plants produce a large number of small seeds, ensuring that at least some of them will grow and eventually produce. So notice here the difference. So this is a plant and the kestrel was an animal. But the difference here is the kestrels, both parents, let's put up here, both parents care for their chicks. So there's a lot of parental care here. All right. And plants where there may not be a lot of protection and for their kids, they produce a large number of small seeds, hoping that some of them will survive and therefore keep the population on going on. So that's where we see a dandelion. All right, the dandelion, each one of these at the end of the little fuzzy thing, there's a kind of a stalk down here at the end is the seed. And the seed, remember, seeds contain baby plants. Alrighty. This is a Brazil nut. Also has inside here, it has a pod, and inside many seeds inside. So it's another example. Other types of plants produce a moderate number of large seeds that provide a large store of energy that will help the seedlings become established. And so this is the example with the Brazil nut up here. Okay, so different animals and plants have different strategies. And so that's what we're going to start looking at next. K selection. Remember K referred to carrying capacity. Or density dependent selection. Selects for life history traits that are sensitive to population density. All right, what does this mean? These guys are living near the carrying capacity. That means that there's increased competition amongst individuals. Because they're living near carrying capacity, so therefore the amount of resources are limited. You know, there's a finite amount of resources, and so as that population gets greater towards that carrying capacity, they're going to start competing more or have to compete more. Versus our selection, or density-dependent selection, selects for life history traits that maximize reproduction. So density, that's right here, density is well below carrying capacity. Example would be like weeds in an abandoned field. Would be an example of a population that would be our selection where the density is well below. So and R stands for the rate, the maximum rate. So they're close because since they're way below carrying capacity, their rate is high. All right, the rate of reproduction. I gave an example for here. I didn't give an example for here. We could say an old growth forest, meaning that it's been around for a long time, so that therefore populations are established, and so you really can't, there's no more resources for other types of populations. Okay, so many factors that regulate population growth are what we call density dependent, dependent upon the density. So what factors regulate or can limit population growth? So limiting factors. We have density independent factors. Is any factor limiting the size of a population whose effect is not dependent on the number of individuals in the population. So it's not dependent, so hence density independent. An example of such a factor is an earthquake, which will kill all the members of the population, regardless of whether the population is small or large. And so that will limit the population growth, but it's independent. It doesn't matter if the population is big or small, that tornado, it's going to affect the population the same. Versus density-dependent factors. Any factor limiting the size of a population whose effect is dependent on the number of individuals. So an example of this would be disease. The greater density of a population, the more crowded and more close together the organisms are, so disease will spread greater, have a greater rate of spread. So disease will have a greater effect in limiting the growth of a large population since overcrowding facilitates its spread. And so those are density-dependent and independent factors that help to control and regulate population. So let's look at this. In density-independent populations, birth rate and death rate do not change with population density. And then birth rates and death rates rise with population density would be density dependent. So density-dependent birth and death rates are affected by many factors such as competition, territoriality, disease, predation, toxic waste. So these are density-dependent things. I gave you one thing up here with a disease, but here are a few more. So let's look at competition for resources. In crowded populations, increasing population density intensifies competition for resources and results in a higher or lower birth rate. Lower, right? Because you're limiting resources. And so these are just the picture of those 6 things up here that we just read through. All right, let's turn the page. So competition is one, disease is another. So population density can influence the health and survival of organisms. In dense populations, pathogens can spread more or less rapidly. More. Predation, as prey populations build up, predators may feed preferentially on that species. So as the prey population builds up, the predator population will also build up in response to that, and sometimes it'll go back down. We'll look at that a little bit down here. Territoriality in many vertebrates and some invertebrates, competition for territory may limit density. So some organisms fight for or mark their territory, fight for their territory, and so they're not going to get that dense. Toxic waste. Accumulation of toxic waste can contribute to density dependent. The more dense the population, the more waste can be built up in that population, and therefore that might be a form of self-control. Population dynamics. The study of population dynamics focuses on the complex interactions between biotic, living, abiotic factors, non-living, that cause variation in population size. So for instance, let's look at some long-term population studies that have challenged the hypothesis that populations of large mammals are relatively stable over time. Both weather and predator population can affect population size over time. So, for example, the moose population on Isle Royale collapsed during a harsh winter when wolf numbers peaked. And so you have 2 lines here, and so let me grab a couple of highlighters here to highlight So here's the wolf line. It's easier to see. Here's the wolf line right here. I think it's easier to see. And then the moose line. Whoops, sorry guys, I'm off the thing. I just highlighted the wolf line, and I'm going to highlight the moose line in pink. All right, so moose and wolves. Okay, so the numbers are greatly different. So this is over time, and this is the number of wolves. There's less wolves, and there's more moose. So we have 2 different y-axes with the different numbers to represent that, so we can accurately see. So Isle Royale. Isle Royale is an island in Lake Superior, right by Michigan, and the wolves and the moose are the greatest long-standing study of this predator-prey relationship ever. All right, and so the thing is that the wolves' diet is mainly moose. So therefore, when you have organisms in which the diet is mainly one thing, what you see is rises and falling of predator and prey in relationship to one another. So if you notice here, we see the wolves going up. The moose going up. The moose is pink. Moose going up, that's the prey. And then notice right after that, the wolves start going up because there's a lot to eat. And then as the wolves go up, then they start hunting more moose, and the moose go back down. And then following shortly after, the wolves go back down. And as the wolves go back down, that's the predator, the moose start going up, all right, and so on and so forth. So that's one example of a predator-prey relationship. Now what I want to do is talk about the next part of the graph where the wolves drop down and now your moose go up, and you can see here the wolves start going up because there's more food, but look there's not that many wolves, and you get this huge crash in the moose. That is around 1995. That's what they're talking about here. Collapse during a harsh winter when the wolf numbers peaked. So if we look here, the harsh winter, that's around 1995. Okay, and so that's that second. Crash here with the crash meaning it goes down very rapidly. All right, so that's an example of showing weather and predators playing a role in the regulation of this moose population. So then let's look at just in general population cycles. So some populations undergo regularly what we call boom and bust cycles. So another popular example of this is the lynx and the hare. Lynx population followed the 10-year boom and bust cycle of hare populations. Hare are rabbits. So if we look here, all right, we have the snowshoe hare and the lynx. So two main hypotheses have been proposed to explain the 10-year interval of this. So basically, as we look at this, the same idea, when the snowshoe hare population goes up, there's a lot of prey, the lynx population follows. Then as the lynx population goes up, they eat a lot of snowshoe hares, the snowshoe hare population goes down, and in response, the lynx population goes down. And so you get them following one another in a manner much similar to what we talked about with the Isle Royale wolves and moose. So the first hypothesis is the hare's population follows a cycle of winter food supply. And if this hypothesis was correct, then the cycles should stop if the food supply increased. You wouldn't see that bust part, all right? So you wouldn't see that 10-year boom and bust. Boom meaning increase, bust meaning decrease. And additional food was provided experimentally to hare populations, and the whole population increased in size. So you had more hare, but continued to cycle. So you still had the boom and bust, which then disproves that it's the food supply. So this data does not support the first hypothesis. So then the second hypothesis, the hare's population cycle is driven by pressure from other predators. In a study conducted by field ecologists, 95% of the hares were killed by predators, including lynx, coyotes, hawks, and owls. So this data does support the second hypothesis. The availability of prey is a major factor influencing predator population dynamics. So as long as you have prey, then the predators can increase and so on. When prey becomes scarce, predator species begin to prey on one another, because especially if there's if they feed on just one organism. So up here, the lynx main diet is snowshoe hare. So in the Arctic ecosystem, there is very few diversity. There's very little diversity in the types of organisms. So therefore, if the hare, which is the main diet of the lynx, goes down in number, then the lynx don't have other organisms that they can draw on to eat for energy and so on. So therefore, they begin to go down in number, and they're looking for energy, and that's where they can turn on each other. That's when it says that they begin to prey on one another, accelerating the collapse of the predator population. And so it begins to go down. And so we see that, like I said, best in when predators prey on mainly one type of prey. All right, so lastly, let's look at the human population. No population can grow indefinitely. We as humans have been growing at a very fast rate for a long time. The global human population, the human population increased relatively slowly until about 1650 when they began to grow exponentially. All right, so that's that J-shaped curve. So that's what this picture here is showing you is 1650 begins to grow exponentially. And so the global population is now more than 7 billion people. Do we have a global carrying capacity, do you think? Yeah, absolutely. How many humans can the biosphere, that's the living part of the earth, the part of the earth that contains living organisms? There's some predictions. They predict a global population of between 8.1 and 10.6 billion people in 2050. So we try to estimate the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of the Earth is uncertain. We don't really know. We can make estimates based upon how we're growing and looking at logistic growth models, the S-shaped curve, how much habitable land, meaning land that we can live on, and the availability of food. Food is going to be a huge issue to grow enough food to feed everybody. So limits on human population size. The ecological footprint summarizes the aggregate land and water area needed to sustain the people of a nation. So, for instance, an average person in the United States, how much land do we need? And land meaning not only the place that you live, but how much land do you need to grow the food that you eat, and in the water that you use, and so on. And so that's what's called your ecological footprint. It's a one measure of how close we are to the carrying capacity of Earth. Countries vary greatly in ecological footprint size. So like somebody in the United States has a much greater ecological footprint than somebody that doesn't use all the energy we use and wasteful with water and so on and so forth. So somebody from a different country may have a lesser ecological footprint. They also can be calculated, ecological footprints, using looking at energy use. So the average per capita energy use differs greatly between developed and developing nations. We are a developed nation. Developing nations have greater birth rate. They have more of an agricultural society. They don't make as much money. And so we are definitely a developed nation, and our energy use is much greater than developing nations. So overall, globally, our carrying capacity could be limited by food, space, non-renewable resources like oil, and the buildup of waste. What are we going to do with all the waste? And so, unlike other organisms on Earth, we can regulate our population growth through social changes. And so we have an advanced brain to be able to handle and to work to solve some of these problems that we face with a growing population. And that is chapter 52.